Hello, this is our proof of concept for a research question on how does the cultural background of young people, 18 to 25 years, of Chinese ethnicity impact their day-to-day life?
So, I'd like to talk a little bit about why we chose this topic. The increasing presence of the Chinese diaspora in Australia has exposed a rich field for research, and so far, much of the data has been quantitative in nature. More qualitative data would give a much deeper understanding of individual perspectives, especially as the subject matter itself is inherently subjective and difficult to make generalized overviews of. We can also find an easily available population of both foreign and locally born Chinese in Australian universities. So this data should be contextualized to understand the whys rather than simply the whats of the attitudes held by participants.
Why does this research matter, you ask? This research will allow for a deeper understanding of Australian multiculturalism through potential similarities and differences in the responses and the factors which shape the notions of identity within our participants. It can also assist in a better understanding of integration problems and effects. The data may be useful for future immigration and educational purposes for both Chinese and Australian backgrounds.
We also thought we'd explain our ontological position in relation to the research question and how this will benefit our type of study. Ontology itself refers to our view of what the social world is made up of and if it exists independently of our understanding of it. Our chosen ontological position for this study is constructivism, meaning that we believe that social phenomena are produced through human interaction and are thus dynamic and constructed, though also very much real. Our goal is to understand what factors make it up within our area of study. We felt that this constructivist approach would be more closely fitting to the topic in comparison to realism, as it pertains to social phenomena existing independently of our understanding of it. They have an essence in their own right out there, and as described above, it does not fit the structure of our research as closely.
We'd also like to explain our epistemological position, interpretivism. We don't believe that knowledge is objective, and we hold the conviction that it always carries a degree of internal bias and that context is crucial to understanding how phenomena can be observed and discussed. In this way, researchers cannot be separated from the world and carry an impact on how data is collated. We're focusing on an experience-based, individual identity-focused responses and depictions on how the phenomena is understood by the participant. We felt this position pertained better to the research when compared to a, say, positivist viewpoint, due to its relation to knowledge being pursued as objective and valued-free.
With regards to methodology, we are focusing heavily on qualitative data, examining responses that involve meaning making with a range of different perspectives and participants' understanding of the phenomenon are expressed. Our methodological position reflects a systematic regime of data collection that is not standardized, and that is why interviews are a good choice. This way, we can look at underlying opinions, motives, and observations that are true to the individual in relation to the phenomena and context that can be collated.
So with data collection, we chose between two means of qualitative data collection. We considered focus groups as they are discourse-based and would allow for two groups of Chinese people of different backgrounds to bounce ideas off of each other. However, we ultimately came to the conclusion that interviews would allow for more control and greater detail. And so we intend to use one-on-one, face-to-face interviews for our data collection, as we feel it is the best means of gathering personal, highly detailed answers to the questions that we have. The qualitative research works well with our interpretive epistemology and constructivist ontology, given that we aren't necessarily seeking to have generalizable or reproducible results. Now, in terms of the sampling, we're primarily seeking university students, as they fit into the age range of the group that we're studying, and we have no preference of gender. However, we do acknowledge the fact that the data will likely be skewed to contain a more middle to upper class response, as our sample is largely university student based.
So within our overall research question, we also have a list of sub-questions. This is the exhaustive list of all the sub-questions we feel that are important to building understanding of our research question. However, due to their number and size, they are rather dry to go through. So we've broken down the key areas which are designed to draw out data from their participants.
So the general groups include perceived similarities and differences amongst different Chinese ethnicities. So, for example, how a mainland Chinese person might perceive a Malaysian Chinese person and whether or not they would consider each other as belonging to the same community. There's also language fluency's impact on cultural identity and group interactions. The simplest example of this is that of an Australian-born Chinese person being unable to communicate properly with their extended family, which likely plays a heavy role in deciding their cultural identity. Next, we have the relationship with family and cultural heritage. We are interested in seeing if participants report non-Western family structures and dynamics and how this affects the participants' cultural identity. We also have work, social, and academic life relating to cultural background. This predominantly focuses on expectations or lack thereof, perceived by participants' family or culture to certain standards or aim towards certain careers. Next, we have the experiences and interactions with those of different ethnicities. As the interview begins to wrap up, the participant is asked to review their experience as an individual of Chinese ethnicity in a predominantly Caucasian nation, providing important data in observing if and how they identify themselves as separate from other ethnic or cultural groups and identities. Finally, we ask them about their cultural background and Australian identity. This area rounds off the interview, asking participants to reflect on how all previously discussed factors affect their perception of national and cultural identity, be it shared, singular, disconnected, or minimal. We will now go through each of the sub-questions in each of these areas in greater detail to give a better understanding of what data our research is trying to generate and what we wish to achieve through it.
Okay, so our first sub-question is, how do participants' linguistic capacity with either Chinese or English impact their interactions with other people of Chinese ethnicity? We believe that language serves as a means of communication and connection, but it can also function as a barrier between understanding and interaction. As a result, language can become intertwined with culture and the way people come to perceive and enact it. We want to analyze how this can impact upon the interactions our participants have had with those who are varying levels of fluency with either Chinese, English, or both. As there can be countless differences in the fluency of an individual's language, whether it is their first or second or even third language, there is an expectation that social divides or tensions may form between different persons of Chinese ethnicity. Now, we want to examine these language barriers and how they either enforce or bridge the gap caused by cultural divide, specifically in relation to the family unit and broader Chinese community. In previous studies by Smolik et al., being able to speak Mandarin is at the very core of being a Chinese, even among those who are monolingual, and we want to examine whether this is the case in our own studies. Our second sub-question is, how do participants' linguistic capacity, with Chinese or English, impact their cultural identity? This question looks more inwards as opposed to the previous question, which is looking outwards. It expands up the participants' language fluency and the connections this allows for, or denies between family or community members. We wish to examine how the participant views themselves culturally. It is often said that we define ourselves with the language we use, and in a literal sense, this is intuitively true, since words are central to our ability to articulate information. But this can also appear in more subtle ways, as studies have shown that the way people think and feel is influenced by the languages we formulate our thoughts with. This, then combined with the participants' feelings of inclusion or exclusion from cultural or familial bodies, is likely to contribute to their overall sense of cultural identity. Language level may serve as a prerequisite for feeling a sense of belonging to any group. In addition, in terms of how it influences familial relations and by extension self-esteem, Tannenbaum and Howie found that perception of those who use their mother tongue with their parents, while more cohesive with the rest of the family, will lower hierarchy-wise. And we want to examine how that comes into play in terms of our participants as well.
Our next question is in regard to how do participants perceive ethnic Chinese of other backgrounds, for example, dialectical, country or region of origin, etc., and what similarities and differences do they believe their experiences have? The goal of this line of questioning is twofold in nature: to understand how different Chinese ethnicities perceive each other, positively or not, but also to identify which qualities the participants outline as being the greatest sources of similarity or separation. These factors, such as language, appearance, culture, or beliefs, are significant in forming a picture of what goes into forming a national culture or cultural identity. For example, participants may report being more comfortable speaking Chinese with other persons of Chinese ethnicity, such as international students, leading to the conclusion that they perceive themselves as being part of a similar or a singular community. Our next question is in regard to how have the relationships that participants have with their families been shaped by their cultural heritage. Cultural factors, we believe, play a strong role in shaping the way an individual is brought up, affecting everything from parenting techniques to family dynamics. The development of one's ethnic identity is thus heavily shaped by both familial and cultural factors, highlighted in a study held by Rosenthal and Feldman, who expressed that the family has been implicated as a significant force in this process. providing its children with their first experiences as members of a particular ethnic group. Generational and cultural tensions, sometimes exacerbated by linguistic barriers or by the contrast children growing up in a predominantly Western nation are exposed to. For example, Western parenting is typically characterized by less expectations or strict rules than Chinese parenting. We also believe that the social demographic of the participants' parents may also influence the relations between them and their children, as found by Zhao and Zafir, as middle-class relations were far less strained due to the acceptance and adoption of the Western norms of the country. While this was an American study, it remains relevant to Australia, as many cultural norms and practices are shared by the two primarily Western nations.
Our next sub-question is, how are the familial and personal expectations of participants' academic and/or work life shaped by their cultural background? Cultural background often plays a large role in defining individuals' work ethic. Pressures to achieve goals or milestones initially come, traditionally, from exterior influences, such as families, friends, or overarching cultural trends, which are all part of a cultural tapestry, which can then lead to participants having such expectations for themselves or for others. Tensions can also arise between contrasting work-life cultures for young individuals, with the Chinese background interacting those with alternate backgrounds and expectations. And this sets up the importance that familial validation can have impacting individuals' work and academic achievement and pursuits. Performance in work or academia ultimately defines one's role in society, so their social or familial expectations of this performance can shape an individual's life. Previous findings by Espiritu 2002 and Wolf found that there is a tremendous pressure on young Chinese people to do well academically and also to pursue careers in fields such as medicine, law, and engineering, irrespective of the personal preferences. This increased expectation of academic excellence and achievement is thus something we would like to understand better. The next sub-question is, how do participants believe their interaction with people of similar backgrounds differ from interactions with people of other cultural backgrounds? We'd like to understand what differences exist between what constitutes an in or an out group within varying Chinese or non-Chinese ethnicities, and how participants interact with those of differing background. For example, if there are differences in attitude or pre-existing stereotypes ingrained by previous generations. All in all, we'd like to understand if, as a whole, these differences between groups of differing cultures are positive or negative. Next, the sub-question we'd like to look at is, how does the cultural background of participants affect their view and inclusion within Australian national identity? This is an incredibly important question for understanding the manner in which identity and ethnicity intertwine, but from the perspective of a Western nationality that the participant may or may not feel they belong to. The nationalism of a Western state can often become conflated with being white. As a result, it can prove to be a stumbling block for those of differing descent in finding acceptance within the national identity. There is an expectation of cultural dissonance, perhaps the feeling of discrimination or hardship arising from this difference. Potential occurs for participants to feel a refusal to assimilate or acclimate to the Western culture, and instead hold on tighter to their original or prescribed Chinese identity. There might also be cases where inclusion and acceptance are commonplace for the participants, and they feel integrated into the Western community, irrespective of potential cultural or appearance-based differences. It may even be possible for some participants to hold two different national identities without issue, or, alternatively, to feel alienated by both, since they are not wholly one.
So what do we expect to see overall? We expect to see conflict between generations of Chinese Australians over moral, ethical, and cultural values. In particular, we expect this to arise from language barriers between parents, grandparents, and children, leading to abnormal dynamics in which the parent and child fail to have conversations that would be common in either culture. We also expect to see a certain amount of cultural divide between Australian and mainland Chinese, possibly leading to cliques or cultural dissociation. This will also likely result from language differences and complex ideas in either language poorly translating. On the flip side, we also expect to see division between Chinese Australians and Australians. This will, of course, be on a spectrum. Not every case will be the same. Some Chinese Australians will identify more with the Chinese side, and others will identify more with the Australian. However, we do expect to see disruptions due to family values, social mores, and linguistic nuances poorly translating, and we also expect to see some possible issues with racial tensions. We also expect to see issues of identity with Chinese Australians, potentially looking down on their own culture or language after exposure to Western cultural norms. We also expect to see, potentially, a failure to be accepted by peers of either category, being seen as either race traitors by perhaps more culturally Chinese, or being seen as outsiders by local Australians. Ultimately, we do expect to see the development of what we might call third culture kids, people who don't fit into either category, and as a result create their own identity as a coping mechanism, one that mixes both Chinese characteristics and Australian characteristics. As a proof of concept, we performed a sample interview with a participant named Doris. Transcriptions are available on request. She was born in China and speaks Mandarin at home, but spent most of her schooling in Australia. She considers herself most comfortable communicating in English rather than in Mandarin, and believes she's not traditionally Chinese. She frequently referred to Chinese language as a cornerstone of Chinese culture, but also as an alienating factor for her due to her limited command of the language. As a result, she struggles to identify herself as Chinese, in her own words. However, she also appears to believe that she doesn't truly embody Australian identity, especially to others, due to her Chinese background and appearance.
Overall, this interview brought along many insights on interview methods to be used. It brought up questions about the role of the interviewer, as sometimes the questions were phrased somewhat unclearly and the interviewer asked for clarification. She occasionally asked for examples, and responses tended to focus on the given examples and often responded to the specific wording of the interviewer rather than the general sub-questions. There was also an influence of an insider and outsider group, since some insider positions were present with the interviewer, such as the ability to refer to concepts well known in Chinese diaspora, such as Malaysian multilingualism and Asian education values. Although many responses overlapped, there isn't enough data to suggest that this is necessarily the fault of the interview questions, and it may just be a quirk of the interviewee. Finally, to conclude, that in an ever-changing global landscape, identity and culture become more important to individuals and even more important to analyze. We believe that there is much to be learned from the way in which people of Chinese descent come to engage with their identity and culture. As a result, attempting to understand and gain data on this leads to great insights as to how culture can impact the day-to-day lifestyles of our chosen target demographic of 18 to 25-year-old persons of Chinese descent.
Through this qualitative research, we aim to discover how different aspects of culture, such as family, language, interactions, and even perspective on others, come to inform the characteristics of or the way our participants view their own sense of identity, with a constructivist ontology and an interpretivist epistemology.
While the research may contain a skew towards the middle to upper class, the stories provided do not aim to serve as an account for the entire Chinese cultural experience. Instead, we acknowledge that we seek a specific insight into the lives of some of those of that ethnicity, although we do aim to cast a wide range of stories with differing backgrounds.
As highlighted by a sample interview, there's much to be learned from this study, and it can prove to be highly insightful into the lives and perceptions of those of varying Chinese descent. An examination of how the individual comes to perceive culture and its influence on their life is relevant in the more connected, multicultural 21st century.